Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Hello, Jai Chinandra. Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Venu Mehta, Bhagwan, Chandraprabha, Endowed Assistant Professor in Jain Studies and Assistant Professor of Comparative Spiritualities at Claremont School of Theology. And today I will be interviewing three amazing professors, Christopher Miller, Cogen Bohanec, and Jonathan Dickstein, about their new edited volume, Engaged Jainism. I'm really excited to learn more about the book and the work inside it. Chris, I'll start with you. Chris, you mentioned that the volume will likely surprise many in a recent blog post about the book. Without spoiling too much, what kind of fresh perspectives or unexpected finding can reader expect?
Yeah, so I recently did write a blog post to kind of address that question in particular. And what I really wanted to do when we first started working on this project was to use the term engaged in a way that might surprise people. And so when we first started working on the project, colleagues would ask me if this is going to be another volume that kind of uncritically applies or engages Jain principles to everyday social life, kind of like how engaged Buddhism began as a field. And what I've tried to repeatedly convey is that it is not that. We are not just kind of uncritically applying Jain principles to the issues of everyday life, contemporary challenges. That's part of the project, but it's not that at all in terms of its overall scope and approach. In fact, what it tries to do is develop a very carefully articulated way of understanding what the word engaged even means when we're using it. So in the introduction to the volume, I'm drawing from a number of different scholarly frameworks, anthropological frameworks, including from Anna Singh, from Garrett Broad, who talks about engaged scholars working with communities, my own work in engaged learning at the university, and also from engaged Buddhism. But importantly, the field of engaged Buddhism in recent years has become quite critical, quite self-reflective in comparison to its early scholarship. So when I say we're drawing from engaged Buddhism, I think what will surprise people is that what readers of Engaged Jainism are going to encounter is how useful the more kind of critical methods that we have developed here, drawing from engaged Buddhism, can be for studying the Jain tradition. So we're doing that for the first time. And this carefully kind of articulated approach that we're using is, in my opinion, probably one of the biggest scholarly contributions the volume makes across all of the chapters who adopt it in some way, shape, or form. So I think what will surprise readers is that we've been quite theoretically rich here, and we've tried to make the volume both accessible to the public as well as to intellectual audiences. It's always a hard thing to strike, but it really allows people to see how rich this field of engaged Jain studies is from the start. And I think that that will surprise many, both scholars and community members together.
Thank you so much, Chris. So when the book will be out, I guess, I'm sure the readers would be very happy to read the book, and they will definitely identify what you have said here about the book and the approach and the methods. Great. So Cogen, the next question is for you. Cogen, the subtitle highlights critical and constructive studies of Jain social engagement. How do you define and differentiate these two modes within the context of Jain social engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of feeds into what Dr. Miller was just speaking about. I guess I would point out that I really think that this work is very seminal, largely because, first of all, I don't think the field or subdiscipline of engaged Jainism has been articulated. There's been a lot of work on applied Jainism, which is kind of gesturing in the same sort of direction. But what Dr. Miller has done in the introduction has really created an articulation of a subdiscipline, and he's added a lot and has actually in many ways gone beyond engaged Buddhism, which is mentioned oftentimes really focused early on activism and such. Dr. Miller articulated three different models: a constructive reproductive approach, a critical analytical approach, and a critical constructive approach. This in itself was, alluding to what you just asked, this was a very nuanced way of looking at the methodology of what it means to do engaged scholarship. Loosely, we can think of critical constructive as being like non-normative, leaning towards empirical methods, objectivity, and even introducing elements of skepticism, or being critical skepticism towards tradition and maybe a sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. But a critical analytical approach is something, or sorry, that's a critical analytical approach, but a critical reproductive approach is something more emic and normative, right? This is like how the tradition sort of self-understands, particularly in relationship to world issues. And then the critical constructive, we can think of this as like a thesis and antithesis and a synthesis between like normativity, non-normative scholarship, and then sort of a blend of both of those, where critical constructive, to address your question, really seems to blend both of those by doing constructive work and maybe even making normative claims, but also doing it in reflection and by engaging in sort of interdisciplinary engagement with other academic fields. So you can have a constructive element of it. For example, I write about animal rights or eco-theology from a Jain perspective, which is construction because those aren't specifically in Jain doctrine itself, but drawn on Jain doctrine and then interfacing with other academic theories. Like I use biophilia and eco-psychology and other fields like that. So that critical constructive approach is really kind of the synthesis between a more objective empiricist approach and one that's like more strictly apologist and normative, and one that really allows the reflection on both of those.
Thank you so much, Cogen. That's really well defined. The volume includes many contributors rooted in Jain studies who nevertheless apply interdisciplinary frameworks like critical animal studies, museology, or business ethics to theorize Jain social engagement. Could you highlight a particularly an interviewing method, Jonathan? As a contributor, can you tell us about how you approach Engaged Jain Studies in your chapter?
Thank you, Vena. How do the kind of chapters all tie into this central theme of engaged Jainism? The chapter that I have added to the volume, An American Pundrapole, is about Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary, which is a Jain-founded animal sanctuary a bit north of Denver, Colorado. And I have some personal experience with the sanctuary going back almost 10 years. And then as I got more interested in how Jainism interacts at this site, it really seemed to tie into a lot of the themes of this volume. So what I'm looking at from the perspective of engagement is, as Dr. Bohanec highlighted, how do Jains, especially Shailin and Shilpi Shah, the founders of the sanctuary, engage with traditional Jain ideas in the present and in the present situation? And this is a present situation, meaning in the American diaspora, and then also in the contemporary age that is dealing with issues around animals and ecology that were really somewhat unfathomable at the time when, say, these initial kind of Jain ethics around animals and the environment emerged. And so there's a question of how are they engaging with these ideas? And then the second question is, from the perspective of engagement, is how are Jains engaging social issues from that lens? So it kind of goes in both directions. And so in my chapter, which is really about the genesis of the sanctuary, which, yes, is founded by a Gujarati Jain couple in Colorado, but it really doesn't start out as founded on Jain principles. So then the question is, if it's founded on principles such as nonviolence, compassion, and a kind of responsibility to be involved with worldly issues, how much are those Jain, or specifically Jain, or are they not just specifically Jain? And what's very interesting in the timeline of the sanctuary is that while it started off as very much non-Jain focused in both its philosophy, orientation, and a lot of its marketing materials, its public-facing content, over time, it has very much integrated its way into the larger Jain diaspora community, meaning kind of who's actually supporting the sanctuary, who's visiting the sanctuary. And over time, the even public-facing content from 11 Arms has become, we could say, more Jainized. And so this really fascinating question to me is how there are values that are very central to Jainism, and many Jains will talk about how they're central to Jainism, but they're also shared values in a sense with a broader community, in which, in the words of kind of Shaolin Shah, they become universalized. These are universal values. And that's fascinating to me too. Are they necessarily universal, or do they actually come from a certain kind of background that Shaolin and Shopi were brought up into that is Jain, but then looks out and sees where it's also operating among a lot of non-Jains, specifically in the animal rights and animal sanctuary movement. So the chapter really is an exploration of how this pans out at the sanctuary, both internally in the thoughts of the founders. I interview volunteers, I interview staff who are dominantly non-Jain, and how it actually looks on the ground. I use loosely, meaning just in any kind of material workings at the sanctuary, in pamphlets, in the website, in any other released content.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's really interesting. I'm now really eager to read that chapter. Okay, so my next question is for all of you. What do you hope the book will achieve beyond the academy? In what ways do you envision it informing practitioners, activists, Jain communities, or readers outside the Jain tradition?
I suppose I can take the first jump at that, and then maybe my co-editor, Cogen Bohanec, can jump in, and then maybe Jonathan after that. I think I can say we hope, as one, to reflect and really echo what one of our anonymous peer reviewers put so well, that this volume will somehow reinvigorate the study of Jainism for students and the general public, a field, as the reviewer noted, that was so ably pioneered by the late Paul Dundas. So I'm kind of quoting what our peer reviewer said, that he really felt like this volume will reinvigorate the study of the Jain tradition, which is very much, of course, in the lineage of major scholars like Paul Dundas, who are really important and set the foundation for Jain studies. I also personally hope that it will invite further critical reflection from our colleagues in Jain studies regarding, for example, how and why we apply Jain principles to issues of contemporary concern, as some scholars do, but also thinking about how our colleagues are currently engaging with their donor communities, because there's been such an infusion of capital into Jain studies recently that part of the engagement that we identify here is the engagement that's taking place between scholars and the academy and donors, and how that's actually changing the landscape of Jain studies. Personally, I also hope it will spark some positive change in the world, given all the manifold polycrises that we currently face. So part of the Engaged Jain Studies project, as Dr. Bohanec has just expressed, is looking at questions of eco-psychology, looking at various issues of how we interact with animals, as Professor Dickstein just said. I hope it will inspire some people to reflect on their own relationships to the interconnected issues of environmental, animal, and social justice, which all are highlighted in the volume in various ways, and it will inspire them maybe to keep trying to make the world a better place. So it's a combination of a sort of academic aspiration as well as a broader public aspiration to improve the world that we live in. I guess I'll pass the baton to Professor Bohanec.
Yeah, I would love to echo some of the things that you said. Certainly, I think we really want people in general interested in Jain studies. We deal so much with issues that are relevant to modern living, social justice issues, environmental issues, animal issues. That's important to us. But also, I think another way of looking at this is that systematic problems require pluralistic solutions. That means that a lot of the violence that happens in our modern age is systematic violence. Systems of racism, global wealth inequality, environmental destruction, oppression of animals, marginalization of different groups. Those are systematic. That means that they're kind of baked into our institutions, they're baked into the paradigms of our culture and our society. In that way, society in total is responsible for these things. We can think of the multiple various different pillars of support that uphold systems of oppression and domination and violence. Those are governmental, they're cultural, but religion plays a part in that as well. So I think it's very important that if we're going to address issues of systematic violence, that religion in general needs to have a seat at the table there. And there's a very common critique that's levied against religion that I think is legitimate, that needs to be addressed. And that is that religion is often so otherworldly oriented that it makes it a little harder to care about this world. If you're so obsessed with the hereafter, at a certain point, you're diminishing your attention to the care and concern about what's happening in this world. And that's a legitimate approach that can really happen in religions in general. And I think a lot of constructive theologians are doing work to address that, particularly like in Christian eco-theology, which is a field that I've worked in a lot, to show how religions actually can address the issues of the modern world and real world society and not be so transcendentally oriented that they then lack care for this world. Now, I think this is particularly germane to Jain studies because I remember studying world religions as an undergraduate, and I remember the depiction of the Jain tradition as if basically they're otherworldly to the point that it's impossible to see how they can be relevant to society at all. This sort of extreme renunciation is literally completely disengaging from any societal norms or any social responsibility. And that's really how this very small brand of Jain asceticism gets universalized so that the Jain tradition is presented as sort of this monolithic, disengaged religion from worldly concerns. But of course, we know that Jain ascetics are only a very, very small portion of the Jain community. And actually, the vast majority of Jains, probably more than 99%, are actively engaged in their communities and using their Jain values to shape how they live in different societies. That's why we have the various different sections in our book. We conceived of those various different sections in the table of contents to show how Jains are living in a way that engage in the diaspora, business and economics, environment, animals, and interfaith engagement. I think we hope to sort of dispel that stereotype, that unfair stereotype of Jains being overly disengaged and therefore irrelevant to social concerns. It's a legitimate critique against religions, but for some reason it gets particularly levied against the Jain tradition in a way that's very heavy-handed and unfair. I hope our work serves to sort of counter that.
Thank you, Cogen. Jonathan, would you like to respond to this?
Well, as a mere contributor, not an editor, I won't speak at length, but I will just like to echo that I think that a common concern, at least from some, I don't want to say critics, but people who have things to say about animal ethics, environmental ethics in Jainism, is that we don't have much historical precedent for a lot of the language and ideas that come in, say, contemporary issues in Jainism. Like these weren't concerns of, say, Jains from hundreds or thousands of years ago. But I think there's a very useful delineation. People like Jeffrey Long talk about this in their work of kind of the historical, like the historical basis and a philosophical basis. So yes, it might be very well the case that historically certain issues like the ones Professor Bohanec mentioned, systemic issues, were just not on the radar of Jains in their time and in their context. But that certainly doesn't make it impossible philosophically to apply some of the ideas they have to our current issues. And I really hope that this volume, exactly as Professor Miller said, just starts to spark engagement to these issues and see how Jainism can be applied. And not only that, there are people, Jains, who are already doing it. So it's not just this kind of scholarly intervention or prod, but actually Jains, a lot of young Jains I talk to who are concerned with issues such as police brutality, systemic racism, food insecurity. I think philosophically, Jainism has so much to say, and this would be part of Engaged Jain Studies, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. So my next question is for the editors of the volume, Cogen and Chris. But both of you have written and taught extensively on Jain ethics and social thought. How did editing this volume shape or even challenge your own understanding of what it means to live Jain values in the contemporary world? And how do you connect it with this volume?
I'll let my co-editor, Professor Bohanec, launch us off there if you like.
I guess it's my turn to go first then. Yeah, I think that just in general, there's such a wide variety of scholars who are doing work on various different topics in this volume. I mean, I get a sense of, like, say, engaged business ethics, for example. I have a general sense of how Jain community really values operating in business with a certain set of ethics and how that can happen, but to actually like read details of the studies like that we saw from Atul Shah and Benjamin Zank in that regard are very, very interesting. Now, Zank talks about how business ethics are educated in the academy and how Jain teachings can inform that. But Shah also does a really comprehensive sort of discussion, is like sort of almost a, I want to say like an emic ethnography or something about Jain business communities and how certain values are portrayed and actually help with one's social capital within those business communities. So hearing the sort of details about how some of that plays and the various different perspectives that each one of these scholars takes, I think that really deepened my understanding of what it means to have like applied religious ethics, I think. I think that was probably the dimension. Certainly, Zenk does that. I do some of that. But I think what surprised me or what interests me and really changed my perspective the most was really looking at the applied ethics, like thinking about Dr. Dickstein's chapter, for example, is a very good example of applied ethics. And I think getting some of those details on the ground, I tend to be more of a meta thinker. I consider myself a meta ethicist. And so it's really nice for me to read the work of people who are really looking at more applied and ethnographic accounts, which generally are not really my realm of scholarship as much. So I think that the nuance and the details of application, I think, were what really gave me a lot of detail and nuance that I didn't previously have.
Thank you so much, Chris and Cogen. Well, my next question is a little similar to the question that I asked earlier, but maybe this will give more opportunity for all of you to speak. The volume brings together voices from diverse geographical and disciplinary context. What was your editorial vision for balancing scholarly rigor with accessibility for non-academic readers, particularly members of Jain community and even beyond?
We really wanted this volume to be intellectually rigorous while at the same time accessible to Jain community members and just the general public. And that's always a difficult balance to strike when you're doing academic work. But I think in general that we've done it. I even think that some of the chapters that are grounded in more deeply philosophical discussions outside of the kind of ethnographic projects that we have here are accessible to a general audience. And I really appreciated that and really leaned into Cogen's expertise in philosophy to be able to make it that way. And so I think we've struck that balance quite well. And the main way we accomplished this also was by creating the three general approaches to engaged Jain studies that Dr. Bohanec described earlier. The first one that he described really makes room for this kind of espousing of Jain values in a largely emic way from within inside the community without having to reflect too critically on what one's saying, because one may not want to or may not have to or may not be trained in such ways to do that. We wanted to create space for those emic insider community discourses, such as how you might be taught in Patshala or in Jain public events or in community publications where they're teaching about Jain principles. We didn't want to exclude Jain voices from engaged Jain studies, is the point, as is often done in the academy, broadly speaking, we could say, right? And in this regard, this first approach is really what John Court called the study of Jainism, which mainly just kind of focuses on how the Jain community reproduces and creates new Jain scriptural teachings and discourse, and oftentimes in response to contemporary issues. And so Dr. Bohanec just mentioned Atul Shah's wonderful chapter. He wrote this great chapter on sustainable Jain business culture in Kenya, drawing from his own ethnographic experience as a community member, his memories of being in that community and what held that community, the social glue that held that community together. So Dr. Atul Shah wrote that from a very insider perspective, and he's very upfront about that. He's not trying to hide that. And so we try to create spaces for these kinds of voices to be able to contribute to engaged Jain studies. The second approach that we incorporated that Dr. Bohanec was describing earlier as well really actually invites that critical commentary on what John Court would call the Jains. And so this becomes a more social project, right? Who are making these claims? That where are they from? What's their gender? What time period are they in? What is influencing the responses that they are giving in their discourse. And we had a number of chapters in the volume that did this as well. So Johannes Belz, for example, had a wonderful chapter about the Being Jain museum exhibition here in Zurich that took place not long ago. So he was invited to write a chapter, and he's really reflecting on the ways in which Jains are coming into the museum from the Jain diaspora in Switzerland, producing a sort of discourse around compassion and nonviolence, and then the ways that the Swiss community is actually reflecting back to them what they see as a kind of uncritical approach. They said, all I've heard is that you're vegetarian. What else do you do for nonviolence, for example, right? So the Swiss community is sincerely asking this of the Jains. And what we often heard and sometimes heard is Jains in the diaspora in Switzerland eat meat, for example, right? So there's this kind of approach to looking at the community, not in a way to take it down, but in a way that is kind of honest, right? And kind of honestly opens up a discussion of like, okay, what's actually happening on the ground? We know you espouse nonviolence, we know you, but how are you enacting that in your own lives? So we have a number of chapters in that regard. And the third approach then looks at how different scholars who are working with Jains and Jain scriptures, so combining John Court's two categories, can try to find a critical and yet constructive solution to a lot of society's most pressing concerns and major philosophical questions. And I feel like in the volume, this is one of the perhaps theoretical achievements, as Dr. Bohanec mentioned earlier, of the kind of thesis antithesis coming together, right? And creating something new. It's Jains working with scholars to achieve a common goal and scholars trying to help them to achieve that goal. I think Professor Dickstein's chapter is a good example of that, of looking and working and knowing the community and trying to articulate their goals for a public audience, helping them reflect on their own goals and what it is that they're doing. There are philosophical chapters like that. For example, Joey Tuminello wrote a wonderful chapter about how Jain discourses on and scriptural approaches to fake meat, or how they might respond to fake meat, can actually inform Western contemporary philosophical debates. And so there's ways in which the Jain community and Jain scriptures, working with scholars in various ways, can help us understand the ways in which the community, as well as scriptures, can help us address these contemporary issues and reflect on them critically and at the same time constructively to come to some kind of informed resolution. And I see Dr. Bohanec may want to also chime in here.
Yeah, I love this question. It's such a question that every scholar should be asked. And more or less, the broader question is like, how are you actually reaching the real world? You know, how is it that we're creating academic work here that also is accessible to readers? As Dr. Miller mentioned, using Jain, drawing on a broad variety of writers, right? Not just academics, but who are academic practitioners as well, too. But I think that also the reader can see themselves in the book. Some readers are academics, and of course, they'll feel right at home with the ethnography and the philosophy, et cetera, that's in there. But also, I think that Jain practitioners will also see a lot of familiar practices and ideas that are part of the fabric of their own lived experience and their own theoretical understanding of the tradition. I think they'll be able to recognize themselves in that as well, too. You don't have to have a double PhD to be able to see things that are also very familiar. But I also think that beyond the academy, activists can really draw a lot of interest, like we've seen in the field of engaged Buddhist studies. And I think this goes back again to sort of what we hope to happen in this book, you know, apart from being the genesis of an academic subdiscipline of engaged Jainism, we'd like to see it also contributing to the broader dialogue of engaged religion and social change. And I think that activists and people who are working on issues of social change will really recognize the issues that we're addressing, the systems of violence and oppression that we're engaging with. We're creating a forum for the Jain tradition to engage with and creating a platform for many of our authors who are scholar practitioners to also voice their own ability to engage in this. So I think that people outside of the academy who are practitioners and activists and people who are working on social change will really see things in this that are very, very familiar to them, that don't take advanced degrees to necessarily understand. So I think this book really goes beyond just the classroom, but can engage with temples and NGOs and people doing similar work like that.
Great. Thank you so much. I really like the way how Cogen expressed this, that readers can see themselves in the book. And Chris, as you mentioned, the emic element, the emic component is really fascinating, that we would be looking forward to read and understand more about. Well, then we are moving towards almost like the last question for today. What future avenues for engaged Jain studies as an academic discipline do you foresee?
I suspect we all have an opinion about this, and I invite all of us to respond to you, Venu, if everyone is willing to do so. Yeah, for me, I want to see more community scholar engagement in projects. And this reminds me, and I briefly mentioned it in the volume, but we ran in the run-up to Thanksgiving 2021 with Jaina. I was on a committee. I was the head of a committee working with Jaina as a scholar. But what we did was we raised money to feed 150,000 meals to 150,000 people in the run-up to Thanksgiving. And that was such a work and labor of love. It was a lot of work, but we fundraised together. We worked with the community. It was during the pandemic, and it was so rewarding to work with such a large community that cared so much about feeding people who didn't have food during the holidays. And so there was a lot of that kind of engagement taking place in that project, this community scholar engagement. But I would love to see that expand and move and grow and see more of that, because that's part of the engaged Jainism, right? It can be things like that, these social projects where we are working with the community, helping the community critically reflect on its own ideas. And I can give you an example just from that. People wanted to serve both vegetarian and vegan meals in the run-up to Thanksgiving, right? And there was this huge debate that erupted within the Jain community. We want to be able to serve vegetarian food. And so we had a whole list of speakers who came on for an event and explained why dairy can be quite violent to the animals, to the environment. Do you really want to put that in the food that you're serving to people and contribute to that violence? So that kind of reflection between the scholarly community that we brought in to give those reflections did change some minds, and people started to realize that, yeah, maybe it's better if we serve vegan meals instead of vegetarian meals. That's just one example, but it happened during that. And there's a learning on both sides. I learned so much from the Jain community and working with them on that. I'd also, of course, like to see a lot more conferences, speaker series, and publications in Engaged Jain Studies, as we are doing. There's so much more to do, as well as, and I'd love to hear Professor Mehta's reflections on this as well. I want to see us create a new generation of MA and PhD students who will take the charge to continue to grow and develop this budding field. As I often tell the students, I think the future of Jain Studies is engaged. I wrote that in the volume, and I think that we really have to focus on this engaged aspect in Jain Studies. And I really think it's a promising way to reinvigorate students' interest, not only in studying, as Professor Bohanec said, the Jain tradition, but also religious traditions from these engaged methods. So Professor Mehta, I mean, you can say it anytime you want, but I'd really love to hear. I mean, we work with you at Claremont School of Theology. You're a professor there in the MA and PhD programs. We'd love to hear your reflections on this question of what future avenues are there for engaged Jain studies as an academic discipline.
Thank you, Chris. Do you want to say something before I respond to this question?
Why don't you go ahead and respond, and then I'll fill in anything left over.
Yes. So the most interesting part of this question and conversation is that the master's program in Jain Studies that we offer at Claremont School of Theology with partnership with Arihanta Institute is named Engaged Jain Studies. And we call it EJS. So it's Engaged Jain Studies. It's not just Jain Studies. So the philosophy, the vision behind making it Engaged Jain Studies is to offer courses, intellectual debate, discussions, assignments, and any courses that are rooted in, and they are based on how Jain philosophies and principles do not just remain within the books, within the scriptures, but they go out and they become attitude, they become approach, they become method how people live, and they also become the lens through which students and scholars, and Dr. Miller says that future scholars like master students, PhD students, how they use that engaged lens to see the world, themselves, and maybe definitely they're going to transform the society that they live in, the community that they shape, and the leadership roles that they serve at different avenues of their life. For example, they are learning about nonviolence, ahimsa, And not just about ahimsa as a philosophical discipline within the Jain tradition, but how it can be engaged, how it can be intersected with different other avenues and fields in the world, not just limited to animals, compassion, forgiveness, but even beyond, like social justice, compassion at larger avenues, aparigraha, non-possessiveness, these things, and business ethics. So it's kind of like this master's program by Claremont School of Theology and Arihanta Institute. It's a very unique program where this journeying and production of, amazing scholarship, intellectual as well as emotional, are happening. The way we see its future, we are going to make it more enhanced, more in depth. So I guess that was my response to this question, but I would like to listen to Cogen and even Jonathan on this.
The future of Jain studies, as Dr. Miller said, is that he hopes for increased engagement between community, Jain community, maybe activist communities, and scholars. I kind of want to refer to what I might call even a sacred alliance between religious communities and scholars that must be preserved and can't be broken, in my opinion. When religious scholars start talking past communities and sort of presenting religious communities in a way that don't match their own self-identity, they don't see themselves in scholarly work, then the power of the scholar's pen redefines and can potentially displace and endanger those indigenous traditions, those religious traditions. This is what we'd call intellectual colonialism, right? And this is a rift between the scholarly community and the religious community that's being studied. I'm really blessed to be in a field like Jain Studies where that sacred bond is still there. Of course, we do things that are different than what practitioners do, and we may even have a critical lens of a Jain tradition in a way that somebody who's more apologist and emic may not. We definitely do something different. But as of yet, we've been able to maintain this sort of bond of trust so that our scholarship is relevant to what the Jain community sees themselves doing. And I say all of this because this, I think, is where the language of engaged Jain studies came from for Dr. Miller, and that we're using increasingly in the field, particularly those of us in this room right now. It came from speaking to what the interests were in the Jain community. Instead of just speaking past the Jain community and doing whatever we want to do and describing the tradition however we want to, Freudian or Marxist or Nietzschean lenses, we are actually able, nothing wrong with those lenses, they're viable academic approaches, but we're also listening to what Jains see their own needs are and their own interests of study as well too. So I think that that's really an important point. And I would like to see the future of Jain studies uphold that sort of decolonial approach where we're working with as partners with the Jain community. Not that we're taking orders from Jains and doing our scholarship only in ways that's being respected, and we still do our independent scholarship. We maintain academic independence and critical thinking, etc. But not to the extent that we then violate the trust between the community that Jain scholars are studying and then potentially endanger those communities. So that's what I really see the future of engaged studies being. And the other thing that I would like to add is kind of an addendum, but I just want to see it more interdisciplinary. That's what I think one of the huge strengths of this volume is. If you just look down and look at everybody's expertise and topics, this is a profoundly interdisciplinary endeavor. So I think that people from varieties of different academic disciplines getting interested in Jain studies, or people in Jain studies employing the methodological lenses from multiple different disciplines, that's what I really like to see in the future of Jain studies. I don't know if Jonathan wants to add something to this as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cogen. I think all I'd like to add is just one specific aspect, and it's not necessarily even unique to Jain studies, which over the past few years, I think I've just gotten really interested in focusing on youth within these communities, especially diasporic youth, and understanding their perspective. And I say that is because if we look at the trajectory, I think this is in Buddhist studies, oftentimes Hindu studies too, it's that you teach the intro. I mean, Venu and I, we both teach the Intro to Jainism course, and we tell students fourfold Sangha, and there's, monks and nuns and laywomen, laymen. But really the history of Jainism, as Chris said, the study of Jainism has really just been about the figure of the monk. This was like literally the main thing we were studying, whether it was vows, philosophy, and so on. Fortunately, we've had so many great scholars then focusing on nuns, and then more and more in studies of the Jains focusing on lay people. But I'm actually even more interested now, those who are on the fringes of the lay community, meaning like young Jains who really are struggling to find their Jain identity and understand what that means, say, outside of India, and really not connected to even a lot of lay practices. So on this podcast, I did an episode called Radical Jainism, and it was with 3 Jains in the United States in their 20s, talking about these issues that Dr. Mehta, you were saying, social justice issues that are just like very, very pressing for them, and very much bringing up questions of what they value, what are their ethics, what are their political orientations. But then they're also understanding that they're kind of part of a Jain community, but it's really hard for them to connect the dots. And I just really would like to see in Jain studies a focus on these groups. Interacting with YJA, Young Jains of America, over the years has brought that up to me as well. Really just listening to what the day-to-day concerns of Jain youth are from middle school through college and beyond. I say that for Jain studies, but I mean, outside of Jain studies, I think that would be just wonderful work as well.
Thank you so much. So I guess we are coming to an end to today's podcast episode of Engaged Jain Studies. And I'm really thankful to Professors Chris Miller, Cogen Bohanec, and Jonathan Dickstein. Jai Jinendra, and we are looking forward to reading the volume. You can explore more about the volume on the website of Arihanta Institute. Thank you so much, Jai Jinendra.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.